So most of this course is going to focus on Automation 101 as it relates to PowerShell to get some basics behind it, and then we'll jump a little bit into how you use PowerShell to drive V for automation. And if we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll dig into the Enterprise Manager API for backup and recovery. So first of all, think of this in relation to the customers, right? Is automation for a specific customer? Backups, should these be manual or automated? When they're creating jobs, how do they know these settings are correct? Because we're not a policy-based engine, so how are they verifying that jobs even get created correctly in the first place? Testing your backups, when it comes to things like data labs and then doing any staged and secure restore with the new features we have in update 4, how are they actually leveraging all this stuff, and how do they make it feasible to do this at scale? And then tracking changes, as time moves on with everybody inside of backup and recovery or backup and replication, how is anybody tracking any changes that are made to these jobs? Because within the UI, it can be difficult sometimes to know exactly which level of the menu you're at to know where you're going to find these job settings. And trying to check this across multiple jobs is really just a pain that nobody should be doing. All right, so specifically for challenges that are faced by your customers, here's kind of a breakdown that I did, and I used this slide during the John Kerr training presentation last week to show, these are a lot of the pain points that I had when I was working in these verticals, and I've heard a lot from a lot of customers. So coverage for SMB, SLED, and commercial, that really just means how many people do they have on the team to do all the functions and get the job done by the end of the day. Everybody faces issues with coverage, whether that's skill set or just being short on people, budget, time, training, life cycles of applications, infrastructure replacements. Once you get into the federal space, it's auditing, it's compliance, it's access restrictions. Enterprise, it's scale, right? It's how can you scale this thing? How can you repeat things properly? Again, time, and then the same thing with auditing. And even when you break into like the VCSP space or managed service providers, it's again kind of the same things. Scalability, repeatability, your time, the need to audit, and then what are the capabilities of your customer? You might have somebody who's an expert in a platform, or you might have somebody who's a beginner, right? Anybody in IT is always short of time, not tasks. So that's really what we're trying to address here. So beginning with the plan, right? This is where you guys need to know what the capabilities are for what we're trying to automate here. So this is everything we can automate, right? We can automate Veeam components. We can automate a virtual environment and Veeam agents. We can automate VBO and VAO if you have those additional products inside of an environment. And we can also deal with staged restores and Explorer restores. Explorer restores is a really fantastic feature that came around in update 4 with PowerShell. We can now like complete command line, a dump of a production database to an entire development stack. If somebody's trying to, re-update information that they have in their production data centers and they want to put it into their testing environment or their development environment, you can now do this with a handful of lines of code. It's awesome stuff that I remember used to take me hours and hours back in the day. So defining success for the organization, right? Plan first, speed and performance. These are not the benefits, right? You want to be able to standardize, to validate, and repeat, right? And then here, MVP, what we're talking about is minimum viable product, right? We want small incremental changes that you can track and see where changes are occurring and validate that they are correct. So as it comes to availability and what we're really focused on here for Veeam, right? We always want to define a goal first. Automation isn't solely about speed and performance, right? That's the advantage. But your focus should be the benefit to the business, which is the accuracy and repeatability of doing this. Again, we're focused on standardization, validation, and then we get the gained efficiencies of that speed and performance by doing all this stuff properly. And you want to try and keep to small incremental changes that we can verify. All right, so getting started with a little bit of basics on PowerShell. So before we go jump into the code, we're going to talk a little bit about what is PowerShell. Right? PowerShell, it's an interactive shell and a scripting language. But right now we're just talking about the console, not scripts. So Microsoft now has this new de facto standard for Windows system management, and it has been this way for years and years now. So PowerShell is basically the replacement for command.exe, but it's now an object-oriented engine. Don't let that scare you. I'll explain it in just a few minutes, right? But this whole thing is built on .NET, so we have access to almost everything within Windows, but it makes it easy to consume, right? It's secure by default, so that means you can't just double click and run scripts like you could in VBScript. And there are additional functionality that's expanded on with commandlets and providers. So that means that both Windows and third-party components can extend PowerShell to do extra stuff. And these primary means of expansion are snap-ins, such as the Veeam commandlets, and modules. Think the built-in Microsoft Windows commandlets and things like PowerCLI. So what all this really means and the true power of PowerShell is, again, that PowerShell is object-oriented. That means that the results that are returned when you run these commandlets are not just text. You're not doing text parsing like you were in a standard shell or even in command.exe sometimes. These objects in PowerShell are a collection of data which represents an item. So think of a file. You know, a file is going to have tons of attributes to the file and then tons of functions that you can run against this thing. And that file itself is an object inside of PowerShell, for an example. So again, these objects have properties that describe the item, and then methods, which is how you actually interact with these things. So this will become a little bit clearer once we get some examples in the command line. And then basic syntax. This is one of the things that people flub the most when they get started with this. So the basic syntax for PowerShell is that all of these commands are verb-noun. And that should be specifically read as verb-noun so that you remember nouns are singular. You need a hyphen between the verb and the noun, which is the verb of the action you're performing, and the noun, which is the object that you're targeting for such an action. Right? So if you understand this, it makes the discovery of commandlets a little bit easier when you're searching for them, and it helps to ensure that you're typing them correctly. So PowerShell also has an approved list of verbs, and in the common category, there's 34. And basically, these are simple things like get, set, new, remove, add, enable, and disable, right? So we'll see an example of this when we go into the code in just a second. And then the number one thing that you guys need to understand with PowerShell is read the help. Believe it or not, the help subsystem is like the power of PowerShell. And this is not meant to be an RTFM before you email Joe for help. This is that as a beginner to PowerShell, like one of the first concepts that you should understand is the help system, because it makes PowerShell discoverable. And if you're willing to put in a little bit of work to just go through and read some stuff, then it's really easy to discover why you're encountering an error or how to use a commandlet or how you can take one commandlet and pipe it directly into another one. So let's go ahead and switch over to a console. All right. So this is a new Windows 10 VM that I've installed. And the only things I've done to it so far were install the BNR console and then put on Visual Studio Code just because that's my preferred editor for code.
Hey, Joe, if I could interject real quick, if you could hit
Sure.
your Zoom button, that'd be very helpful. I mean, it's difficult to see. If we can zoom in a little bit, that'd be perfect.
All right. That a little better?
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Awesome. All right. So with PowerShell starting in version 3, which was, probably 5 years ago now, one of the biggest changes they made to PowerShell was they made the help updatable. That means that the help didn't just get shipped inside of Windows, and it didn't take Windows updates to make changes to those help files. So now with any PowerShell window that you've got, any console that's running as administrator, and here, let me make sure everybody understands what I mean by that. When you go to the Start menu, and when you go down into Windows PowerShell, right-click on the shortcut, and then you want to do Run as Administrator. You'll see the little UAC prompt on it. With PowerShell Run as Administrator, on any box that's got access to the internet, we can update the help files. So we're going to do update-help, and this will go update everything in the background. We don't actually have to even close and reopen the shell to get new updated help files. You'll just see it starts reading everything in. All right. So as soon as this thing is done, we're going to start on the first of our 3 commandlets that we're going to cover today. The first one that we're going to cover is get command. So get command gets all the commands that are installed on the computer And this will cover all commandlets, all aliases, additional functions that are built in, and advanced stuff like workflows, filters, scripts, other applications. This angry red text that's here, basically this thing just says that the Windows Update Provider help didn't update because it was unavailable for some reason. Not something we're that concerned with. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to type in, again, it's verb-noun, so we're typing in git-command, and I want to see how many commands there are just total, right? So I'm going to cheat and send this to measure. So on this brand new Windows 10 box, without having the Veeam commandlets loaded in or anything, I've got 1,600 commands that exist on here. Don't be concerned. Don't get scared at the number of commandlets that are in here. Basically, this is just showing that as of version 5 of PowerShell that's here now on this Windows 10 box, there's a lot of additional functionality that Microsoft has built into just Windows PowerShell in general. This is pure out-of-the-box stuff that you get. So if we want to run git command to find all of the get commandlets that we have, I'm going to go ahead and again type this to measure and see how many we have. So that's 430 commands. That these are essentially the safest commands you can run in PowerShell, right? This goes and gets a piece of information back. That's all it does, makes no changes to the system. I'm only talking about the built-in Microsoft Windows PowerShell commandlets here. Somebody else nefariously might write something that's a git command that actually makes a change behind the scenes, but that's not how it's supposed to function. So now let's get an idea and let's go look at the commands. Actually, you know what? Let's just to show you guys the example of how many approved verbs there are. Let's go through and get our common verbs that exist inside of PowerShell.
Hey, Joe, do you have a second for a question?
Go for it.
Yeah, I've got a question that's coming out here from Adam Berg. Can we use PowerShell to restore for storage snapshots?
No, we do not have PowerShell coverage of the Explorer for storage snapshots. We only have the Explorers as it relates to Exchange, SQL, Oracle, and not coverage for storage snapshots, unfortunately.
Adam, thank you for the question.
Yeah, I've asked for that, but I've been told that would be a long way out. There's just a lot of stuff behind the scenes that would have to go into that. So to get an example of what is in here inside of the core functionality for, hold on. Flip back over to my, come on. There we go. All right. So this is the stuff that's built into PowerShell that's basically the default for running a Windows system, right? This is where you're going to run things like copying items, getting a specific item, which means get me, say, a file or a folder that exists in the file system. You can do things like move. You can do things like remove, which is a delete. And then you can, start a process, stop a process, start a service, stop a service. So this is all the basic like Windows core functionality that's going to be the stuff you would do in like a Windows Explorer or things you would do in Task Manager. All right, to get an idea of how we can actually leverage git command and find something specific in here. Let's say we want to run the git commandlet against git help, right? So this is going to show us, this is a type commandlet, which means it's like a built-in Microsoft command. The name of it is git help. It gives us the version, and then it gives us this source, right, where it came from. This shows us its core, so this is something that's built into PowerShell by default. Okay, and then to take a look at some of the things that make it a little bit easier to get started in PowerShell, really this is going to be your aliases that map back to existing command.exe shortcuts, or even aliases that are mapped to PowerShell coming from anything that's a Unix or a Linux background. So within here, you're going to see some basic stuff that you've got. People are going to know you're going to be looking for stuff like CP, right? Copy item. And then you're going to see del, remove item. So anything that was your normal keyboard shortcuts for quick executable, changing directories, removing directories, things like that. All of these are aliases that are now popped into Windows PowerShell. And so you can find pretty quickly and easily a decent amount of stuff that shows you how to transition from command.exe to using PowerShell as your normal command line interface. And I've got a bunch of this stuff documented and a lot of the basic aliases in my PowerShell 101 guide, which will be referenced in the slides at the end of this thing. So now that we've seen a few examples of just how to list commands in PowerShell, just to see what's available to us, and again, quick easy thing for this is just do a get command and then run either a verb or a noun. Like I'll give you another example here. We'll do get command for everything that I can use against a computer. And this will show me like this add computer is actually to go add a computer to a domain, right? I can remove a computer to disjoin it from a domain, I can rename the thing, I can restart one, I can stop one, which was just shut down. So there's a lot of features that exist inside of PowerShell just straight out of the box, and it's kind of quick and easy to go poke around and just find things if you have an idea of the verb of what you're trying to do or the noun being the object you're trying to work against. So the next commandlet we're going to, yeah.
We've got another question here if you got a second.
Go for it.
This is from J.D. Wallace. Windows has given us a long runway with PowerShell, and it will be supported for a long time to come. But it's clear that the PowerShell core is the way forward and where our future development is focused. What is Veeam's strategy with PowerShell core?
That's a good question, actually. I've asked a couple of the folks on the PM team about that because number one, for anybody that knows the basics of PowerShell, this is going to be kind of a little bit of a diversion from like the 101 stuff. But we're still leveraging PowerShell snap-ins, right? This was functionality that came out in PowerShell version 2. So this was like early on in the days of 2009, 2010 timeframe. Pretty much everybody else in the industry has switched over to modules, even if it's just converting to binary modules. You know, that was the big switch that PowerCLI made a couple of years ago when you no longer had to install PowerCLI as an MSI executable file on a box. You were able to just go pull it out of the PowerShell gallery or download a zip file, put it in a location, and then we're just able to import in those modules. I've talked to PM. There's a bit of rework that would have to be done to just get it into a binary module. The real problem with making the shift completely over to PowerShell Core is that runs on .NET Core, not the full .NET framework that we're utilizing. And my personal opinion on this, from what I've heard from some of them and just me trying to interpret it in my mind, it would be similar to the shift of like the code base being shifted to where we could run VBR on Linux as opposed to just on Windows. It's a lot of core functionality in the product that's written to a version of .NET that would have to be changed. So if it's going to happen, it's going to take a long time before we get there. I would imagine that I mean, I know it's on the roadmap. I have no idea of how long it's going to take for us to actually be able to execute that and get it there.
Great, thanks. Appreciate that, Joe.
Yeah, sorry for the guys where that was just straight down a rabbit hole. It's PowerShell is kind of quick and easy to jump off the cliff into. All right, so again, now that we've got an example of how to list some commands that are available to us in PowerShell, like the real capabilities of PowerShell come in with get help, right? So when you want to discover what function a commandlet actually does, or you want to find specific information about how to use it, like specific parameters that you have to use, you would leverage the get help commandlet, right? So let's reverse things just a little bit, and let's see what information the get help commandlet gets us on the get command commandlet that we were just running. So we're going to invert this a little bit, and I'm going to break this down for everybody, right? So returns the name of the command. It gives us the synopsis and the description. Synopsis is the short, elevator pitch of what this thing does. Description gives you the breakdown and tells you a couple of different instances where you might use this. And then you break into this syntax bit where this shows you, multiple parameter sets that are basically individual distinct ways that you can use these commandlets. There's some stuff that's in here that you guys don't need to know yet. It's outside of the realm of the basics. But basically, this means there's at least one different argument or one different parameter that's going to exist inside of this parameter set that does not exist in the second one. That means as soon as you use one of these differentiating parameters, you're locked into that specific way to run these commandlets. This will be stuff that comes out in my PowerShell 102 guide to kind of break this down a little bit more for everybody. But this is the basics of what gets returned when you run get help against a commandlet. So now that you know there's get help as an available command for you to run that will show you, how to use PowerShell itself, basically. There's some additional kind of conceptual topics about PowerShell, and it explains a little bit more about how it works in the background. So for this, there's these about topics, right? So I'm just going to run get help about _star to just list the topics that are here, right? So all of these are actually just help files, right? These are basically like formatted text files that exist inside of PowerShell that will tell you stuff. It'll tell you about aliases. It'll tell you about arrays. It'll tell you about how you do assignment, right? It'll tell you about how you do math inside of PowerShell when you get to arithmetic operators. You can do all kinds of stuff with PowerShell. You can do loops inside of your logic for scripts. It'll tell you how to do things like advanced functions. It'll tell you about how to get the history of all the commands that you've run previously. So this is kind of where you go when you want to learn a little bit more about PowerShell and maybe how it does something. You can just run get-help and then this about _ asterisk, and this will list out like all of these huge long formatted help files that you can just read through. And these are kind of things that if you pick up one of these a day or one a week, you'll quickly learn tons of stuff about PowerShell that you wouldn't learn except through lots of troubleshooting and lots of errors that you're going to run into if you don't take the time to just go read how they're supposed to work. So if I want to learn something specific about PowerShell, like what it actually means for this being object-oriented, we'll run get help for about objects. So this gives us a quick breakdown and it just says, here's essential information about objects in PowerShell, right? It shows you that every object or every action you take in PowerShell occurs in the context of objects. So as you move from one command to the next command in a pipeline, it moves everything as single or multiple objects that basically get passed through the pipe. And these have different ways to hook in from one command to the next and be able to pass through. But again, the real thing is that this is a collection of data that represents an item. Okay, so this means that it's the object type, so that we know, and that type is what gets passed through the pipeline, so one command knows what to do with the result of a different command. And then it covers methods, which again are like the descriptions, and then properties. Methods, which are the actions, and then properties, which are the description of an item. And then get help itself actually functions by running a wildcard search first for command names. And if it doesn't find a match, then it'll actually go search within the text of all of those help topics to see if it just finds the word you were looking for. And then if that doesn't work, then it eventually gives you back an error and just says, like, there was nothing that it could find that was relevant. That's pretty rare with a lot of the base Windows functionality you're trying to do inside of here. And then one of the best ways to experience the get help commandlet is actually by running the full help. And this gives you, I'm going to warn everybody right now, this is going to give you a lot of information back. So just beware of the scrolling that's going to happen on this thing. But really, the benefit that you get from this when you run the full help is at the top, you're going to get all the same stuff that you had previously, right? You're going to get your name, you're going to get your description, your syntax, and all that stuff. Really, what we want to scroll past is all of this to get down to here. Here we get examples, right? Within a lot of the core functionality of PowerShell that came from Microsoft, there are examples. So PowerShell actually tells you when running help, like this is exactly what you can copy and paste to go get specific usage out of these commands. And it makes it really even more discoverable because these examples are allowed to be displayed in the help system. It's not just a blob of syntax that you used to get in the past with command.exe or with, something like a bash shell. that didn't actually tell you what result you're getting from this command itself. And then Microsoft went a step further with all of this, and for what they kind of figured were going to be the easiest commandlets that a lot of people were going to run to get acquainted with PowerShell, they documented these even better and gave them lots and lots of examples. So I'm just going to run one real quick, which is get process, right? This is essentially going to be the same thing that you would get for looking at a process inside of, say, Task Manager, right? But inside of here, this is going to show you multiple different examples of how you can get specific information from it. Like this one shows getting all processes from a computer. This is how you would filter down the list to get just processes that are Word and Explorer, right? This is where you can get processes where the working set is greater than 20 megs. So the examples kind of show you some more advanced PowerShell stuff that if you just read the help files, and the real ones to go look into are anything around a process, anything around a service, and then even the get commandlet itself. That just kind of shows you a lot of examples that are real easy to get started because I think people are going to go look at processes and services first, and then you're going to dig into a lot of the extra commands that exist inside of PowerShell. All right. And then before we dig into the last commandlet itself, I'm going to step back and do kind of the basics of being object-oriented, right? So like I said before, PowerShell is written to be an object-oriented language, and that scares a lot of people. It makes them think like there's a need to be a developer to actually use it. But that distinction is just the terminology for the use of PowerShell, right? It's really to tell people that are Windows and Linux users that PowerShell is not running commands and returning just text, right? You have all these objects, and they each have a method and a property to them. So basic example outside of code is like if PowerShell gave you back an object that were a car, these properties would be things like a manufacturer, a model, a body style, or a color, right? Real world example within Windows would be, say, an object of a file type would have properties such as the file name, the path, the extension to it, your timestamps for creation, last access, last modified, and then file attributes, right? So the methods, again, are like the functions you can perform against an object, and these let you modify that object itself. So for the car example, methods would be functions such as rolling down the windows, turning on a radio, starting the car, opening the doors. For a Windows file object, these would be things such as creating a file, deleting a file, appending the contents of that file, copying it to a location, moving it to a different location, or opening the file itself, right? So to see some more examples and understand the object-oriented nature of PowerShell, you use the get member commandlet, right? So get member is pretty cool. It leverages some really fantastic technology that's part of .NET, which is called reflection. And really all this is this means that you can tell an object to describe itself to you. So that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and start a process that most people would be familiar with of Notepad, right? Now I want to get this process inside of PowerShell and see what it gives me back, right? So now this will explain to me, here's the handles, here's non-paged memory, here's paged memory, here's my working set, like processor time, the actual ID of the process itself, a session ID, and then what's the name of the process. So this list of properties is not all of the properties that exist for this Notepad process. And these are not randomly or even like alphabetically selected, right? PowerShell has these formatting files that for all of these object types were created by Microsoft and like preloaded into the system. And basically this is what Microsoft thought would be the most useful detail about an object. But if we want to see everything that exists for this, we're going to go ahead and take that process object that we get back from getProcess and pipe it into getMember. So this now shows us these are all of the methods and properties that exist for this thing. So basically you're looking and seeing that with this method, I could close Notepad if I wanted to, right? You can run kill. That's one of the other aliases for ending the session. You could refresh it. You could start another process of it. The processes properties tell you things like what was the exit code of a process if you killed it? You know, what's all the details that you have for memory within working sets, and virtual memory size or page memory size and things like that. These are going to be all the same details that you would find if you were looking at this process inside of, say, Task Manager. You know, if you're trying to find a rogue process or you're trying to find which one of your 50 notepad objects you have open is the one that's actually consuming all of your resources, this would be how you would find that sort of information. And then going back to the explanation on the type of objects, the first thing that gets returned to you when you run get member against any object inside of PowerShell is this type name, right? Technically, it's system.diagnostics.process, but the short name or the abbreviation for almost every type name is normally just the word that appears after the last period. So this is a process object, right? You could go search systems.diagnostics.process for help, or you could just search process for help. You're going to get, for the most part, the same results. But that type is how we link commands together within PowerShell, right? So if an object, like a file object, you know, gets piped to another command that's expecting a file object, it knows what to do with it. If you take a file object and send it to a command that's accepting a process or a service, it doesn't know what to do with that, and that's where you're going to run into an error, because it just says, I don't know what to do with a file object. I'm trying to work on a process, or I'm trying to work on a service. So again, these properties and methods are really mostly familiar to any, you know, somebody that's got basic experience within Windows. And it's going to be the same stuff you're going to see, again, in Explorer and Task Manager. So a good example of this is to say, like, let's go look at a service object itself. And pretty much the default for anybody to actually play with, because we never break anything, is bits. All right. So if we look at the bits service, we see that we have properties like, can we pause and continue thing? Can we shut it down? Can we stop it? What's the handle? What's the service name? What services is it dependent on? What is the type of the service? And then what is the start type? You know, is it an automatic? Is it disabled? Is it a manual? And then you have the methods like close, where you can shut down the service. You can pause, you can refresh, you can start and stop. So again, basic stuff if you're working with services from within the MSE snap-in for services. You now just have this functionality for all of these different types of objects inside of PowerShell. So one console, you can do almost everything within Windows, and it all looks pretty similar because PowerShell is intending to take all of these differing types of objects and make them look kind of like a file tree, right? That's the real easy way to describe it. Is everything is kind of like an explorer view. You can go through and you can look at one level being the object, and then you can look at the, you know, what would be like the items underneath a folder, which can be the methods and the properties, right? It'll show you everything that exists as part of that top level object. And it does this with things like files, with services, with processes. You can even do this with Active Directory, with DHCP, with DNS. Anybody that's using VMware can do the same thing with PowerCLI. You know, you can navigate a data store the same exact way that you can kind of navigate the properties of a VM object itself. PowerShell kind of just glazes over whatever it is and makes all the objects look the same, or at least have kind of the same underlying framework. So that's what makes it really easy to try and discover what exists and then work with the objects. So now to get a little bit just basic, simple example of how we're going to work with properties. Let's go take that notepad object, and let's say that I want to get, let's see, the window title, the paged memory size, the priority class, and the start time for this object. So now I can run this get process object for Notepad, and then I tell it I'm actually running a select, giving back these properties of main window title, page memory size, priority, class, and start time. And now, instead of the set of properties that I had before when I ran get process for Notepad of handles and memory and process name, I get exactly the properties that I'm looking for just because I've specified them with select object. So if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more on PowerShell and making it easier to look at the exact details of what you're wanting on these objects, go read the help for select-object, and that'll kind of explain to you how to pick out these properties that you're wanting to get. So I know this is a lot of stuff, and I know some of this is a little hard to wrap your head around until you get to play with it, but do we have any questions around basics of PowerShell before we jump into the Veeam and PowerShell basics?
Okay, Joe, I'm going to monitor the question area. Don't have anything in here right now, but I'll let you know.
Making sure. All right. Okay. So let me drop my sharing on my desktop real quick. So Veeam and PowerShell basics, right? So again, when we're digging into the PowerShell basics, remember, get help as your friend, right? The PowerShell is built for pipelines, so you want to really kind of understand how to get one object from a command and then feed it to the next command that knows how to handle that type of an object, right? Eventually, you're going to stack these commandlets and results together like Legos. You know, if you're outdated on this concept, go buy yourself a set and look at the instructions. You know, the finished result that you end up with is not exactly even all of the individual components you see, because there's stuff on the inside that's not visible from the end result. If anybody figures out how to expense buying a set of Legos to teach yourself some automation, you know, please drop me a note and let me know. That'd be fantastic. And then forget what your teachers told you, right? Repurpose or cheat and steal code wherever you can. Look for help. This is the real world, right? It's open book. We have tons of help that exists within our documentation around PowerShell, and then within the Veeam forums specifically around PowerShell, you know, and lots of people that go out there and just say, hey, I'm completely new to this. I don't know what I'm doing. I need help. And there's lots of us, you know, customers and service providers and Veeam employees that will jump in and help everybody wherever we can to figure this stuff out. All right. And to the point of you're not starting from scratch, we have example code out there, right? Within Veeam Hub, there's an example for a complete unattended install of Veeam itself. So that's something we're working on updating because there were some changes to update 4a. So hopefully within the next week or two, that's going to be updated to even be a complete base install for update 4a. And then once you have Veeam installed, you know, there's some options for automated Veeam deployment and configuration. I did some sample code as part of my VeeamON presentation last year, so it's 22 lines of code. Does the basics of setting up a managed server, a proxy, a repository, and like creating a backup job, targeting VMware tags. Advanced is a lot of the stuff that, say, Michael Cade and Anthony Spiteri did for a lot of their lab deployments last year, and that was the back end of what they presented at VMworld 2018, was this full SDDC toolkit to deploy Veeam, where you modify one config file and run a script, and it even builds out like a Linux repository for you. You know, it does some really super fantastic stuff with Terraform and things in the back end. But you can go look at all of this code, pick it apart, see what's in there, learn a handful of extra things within PowerShell for Veeam, you know, and you have a place to get started. Here's just kind of like some guide rails to say, you know, this is what I'm trying to do. Here's how somebody did this component, and you can kind of work from there. So within Veeam, what are we trying to do, right? You're going to target a job for a host, a cluster, a VM, templates, data stores, resource pools, or tags within VMware. For Hyper-V, you know, unfortunately, you're a little bit limited. You can do hosts, VMs, and volumes, right? Pro tip here, obviously, if nobody knows this, go use vSphere tags. If you build these out properly, your backups are now basically a subscription model for your environment. You know, the automation there is you built the job and you set it to a tag. Now, anytime someone tags a VM, it gets caught in that next run of the backup job. It's fantastic. Nobody's even having to touch anything outside of your virtual environment, like at deployment time. For agents, you can cover things like protection scopes, the groups, the scheduling, and all of the options for any guest applications that you have inside of there. And again, like I said earlier, the explorers, we can cover SQL, Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Oracle. Unfortunately, there is not code coverage for the um, storage snapshots explorers, as was asked earlier. That would be fantastic, but it's just not there quite yet. So let's go back to look at some basics of Veeam code. All right. So to start working with Veeam, the first thing we're going to do is load the Veeam PS snap-in. Basically, this is loading the module that has, the snap-in that has all of our commandlets, which will then get reinterpreted and called a module from this point forward. So I'm going to connect to my VBR server inside of my lab. And for most of the stuff that I'm going to run here for just Git commands, this is the same stuff that if you guys wanted to learn some of these basics and you say didn't have this available inside of your lab, or if you don't have Veeam deployed on your laptop, at least these Git commands you can run inside of the SE lab and just see the basics of what an object looks like. So you could do a kind of a stare and compare from the UI to what it looks like in code. So to see what exists in this module, as you can tell by the speed at which everything's scrolled by, there are tons of commandlets that exist inside of this Veeam toolkit, 734. And I want to say 140 to 150 of these were all added with Update 4. So there's been a lot of work that's been happening with the Veeam PowerShell snap-in in the past couple of iterations. And the biggest things, again, were like coverage for agents and coverage for explorers, which just come around in Update 4. And that was something that was kind of a lacking component with new functionality that came in the UI in Update 3 and Update 3A that didn't quite make it into the cutoff for the PowerShell snap-in. So that came in just a little bit after the agent functionality came into the UI. So let's run a basic command for getting a VBR job that I've got inside of my environment. So here is the object representation of this job, right? If I go look in the UI, it's pretty quick and easy to see that you get a lot more information with the basics of looking at the object inside of PowerShell than you do just looking at the UI itself. Because there's tons of extra properties that show in the UI if you go into each and every submenu that are just displayed kind of right at the base level of the object within PowerShell. But to see what actually exists for this object itself, let's go look at what types of things we can do with this, right? So within method, you can delete a job if you wanted to, right? You can get the last state, you can get the last result, you can get the last backup itself. You can find all of the objects that exist in here. This get VI OIJs is actually get all the VM objects included in the job, right? You can set specific credentials for the job for everything that you need for application aware processing or for guest file indexing. When you look at the properties, it'll tell you, is it a backup, right? Like, is it a backup job versus being a backup copy job? Is it a sync being backup copy? Is it a replica? It'll tell you if the job itself is actually running. It'll tell you, is the schedule enabled for it? Is it a tape? So there's lots of stuff that you can find that if you know how to look inside of the UI, you can see it easily, but just at a glance, if you don't exactly know what every one of these types are inside of PowerShell, you can refer back to what it shows in the UI, and then you can kind of match up to see what the properties and the specific verbiage maps from the UI to PowerShell to kind of learn just a little bit of where you're going to find this stuff. So, like I was mentioning before, with this type object itself, right? This type that we have is this C backup job. So let's say I've run this command, I have an actual job object of this core vCenter job that I have in my environment, and I want to find out what I can do with this specific object itself. So now I take this parameter type of this C backup job, and I'm saying get this command, or get any command where I have a parameter type of C backup job. So this means as soon as I run get VBR job, I now have access to copy a VBR job or enable. I can remove the job and delete it entirely, or I can take the job and find what are all the VBR job objects that exist inside of this thing. So let's go run that one real quick. If I could type properly. Oh, and I guess one of the basic tips that I should have covered with the 101 stuff for PowerShell. PowerShell has tab expansion, so if you do things like I did there, where I accidentally typed get VRB, and I try and hit tab, nothing completes. But if I type get VBR job, and I know it starts with O, and I hit tab complete, I get the exact command that I was looking for, right? This get VBR job object. So if you try and hit tab somewhere in the middle of a line in PowerShell and it doesn't autocomplete for you, you've typed something wrong in there. So that's a quick, easy way to catch yourself for basic stuff. So for this job, I can see that I've got a virtual machine with name core vCenter, right? And this is the only object that I have inside of this job. But I get this information by taking the job object and then piping it to this command that gets all of the items that are contained within the job. This, unfortunately, for explaining, PowerShell objects to then have this get VBR job object, the terms don't quite line up one for one. But basically, this is saying, get me this job and then show me every thing that's contained inside of the job, whether this is a VM or a tag or a host and cluster, data store, resource pool, things like that, right? This just shows me everything that's in that job. So I want to do something else with this job. Let's go look and see for this job object that I've got. What's the name of it and is it running, right? Here's the name, it's not running. Let's say I want to start this job. So I can do this two ways. I can say start VBR job. Oops. Sorry guys, bad copy and paste from my other window there. So as you can see by the progress bar that popped up here, I'm now actually running this job by taking get VBR job and piping it to start VBR job. So that means this job is now running in the background, as you can see here, right? So it just kicked off within the last minute. That's why it hasn't even updated to show like a time for the last run yet. But you can take these objects inside of PowerShell, and this is the pipeline functionality, right? Is you can take one type of an object and sync it up with a command that knows what to do with that received object, and it will just start acting on it. So I've got this start job running in the background. So let me go ahead and open a new PowerShell window. And let me get a new connection to my Veeam server going. All right, and now let's look at a different job in my environment. Let's look at this Veeam 1 test that I have. So you can see right here, I have this scheduled and enabled. So I have this job here. It's intentionally a failed job. I'm trying to do some reporting out of the alarms for Veeam 1. But you can see this job has a scheduled next run of 12:25. So let's say I want to disable this job and then prove that it happened. So I'm going to run get VBR job for this name and pipe it to disable VBR job. And it gives me back this entire job object, but all I really care about that I want to see is here's the name and here's the schedule enabled is now false. So if you go back inside of the UI, you can see it's disabled. It has no scheduled run anymore. So this is just, basic functionality of jobs, right? Starting a job, retrying a job, stopping a job, disabling a job. These are all things you can do with just this get-VBR job commandlet and piping it to the appropriate commandlet that will start a job or stop or retry or disable. Now, with the context of VBR backups themselves, the job is the job object and the backup is the actual backup files. This is where everything exists on disk. So if I run get VBR backup, I get this huge blob with every one of these blocks of text being basically a full backup set that I have inside of my environment. So if I want to make this a little bit more digestible, then I'm going to pipe this all to a different command for the select object. And I'm selecting now the name, the job type, the job name. So the backup name may not necessarily match to the job name itself. And then I'm doing this format table auto size just to make sure these have at least one space in between all of these columns that appear on the page. But here you can see, you know, I've got one tag test, I've got a second tag test, I've got this no tag job. I have a conversion test, which is actually being run against a Windows agent. I have this Nutanix job, right, where you can see the actual policy job itself, and then you can see the underlying endpoint backup that exists for the Nutanix VM that's underneath it. And then same thing here, you know, you've got the agent backup itself for this conversion test versus the object, which is the agent management policy that's getting applied to these things. So you can see lots of additional stuff inside of PowerShell that may not even be easily exposed inside of the UI. So I guess now is a good chance to ask some questions of folks, but are there a lot of customers that you guys have that are asking for help, whether it's basics or even things like reporting against your Veeam environment?
If you guys can just drop that info in chat.
I'm going to go ahead and say that.
Yeah, I'm getting some yeses there, Joe.
Cool. All right, guys. So I'm going to run these. So what I'm doing here is I'm just running a couple of PowerShell scripts that I've got in my documents folder on this box. This additional dot that I have here basically means I'm running this script and I'm loading it into memory, right? So these scripts themselves, I mean, the context of these is not hugely important for what the code itself actually looks like. But this one right here, you know, I had a customer that asked me, hey, I run this Veeam backup billing report in Veeam 1 monthly. But the problem is I need the information that's in those tables in like a more easily consumable format. I need to be able to not have to copy and paste stuff out of a PDF file so I can merge together a bunch of different business units. Or I can take departments that are on different billing and be able to break that stuff apart. And we have a, you know, a translation or like a lookup for it based on the VMs, but I can't map that to the way the backup jobs are created inside of Veeam 1 and then the way that it rolls all that up inside of the inside of the report. So I basically went through and spent, I don't know, a day to put all this information back into just the PowerShell code. And again, the code itself is not hugely important, but it's really just the result of this thing, right? If you go run now this commandlet, which I've loaded into memory for this get backup size, I can now pretty quickly and easily get, here's the detail for all of my backup jobs, right? Here's the name of the job, the name of the VM that's included inside of it, a timestamp of when the backup actually ran, the size of the backup, and then I threw in a little cheater of like 15 cents per gig that the thing is running, and it shows me for every one of these restore points that I have, what's my actual cost for this particular restore point of this VM, right? I had to do a little bit of logic in here to make this usable the way the customer's environment was set up. They had some repositories that were running per VM backups, which is how I got this detail of VM name, and there were some repositories that were not per VM backup chains. So the most information I was able to get was for this one particular restore point at this time of 419 and 1250. I've got 3 VMs that are included inside of this restore point. And this is all because I'm reporting from the side of the backup. I'm not taking a step back and looking at the job to get all the job objects. But even at that, I would say for most people, you know, not trying to talk badly against Veeam 1, but to have the capability and the flexibility to not have to have a scheduled report that's emailed to me if I need a piece of information, to be able to, as quickly as this, run a report to get every valid restore point that I have on disk, and when it was created, the size that it is on disk, and even like a generic cost that I'm able to charge back to a department. that's some super powerful stuff to be there for customers to be able to do their own custom reporting if they know what details they're looking for. Here's another one that I had a request for. I had a customer that needed to try and do a migration from a single vCenter to another, and they were trying to get the information of all of the disk filters that existed inside of jobs, which if anybody's ever had to deal with it, it's a huge pain to have to try and do a stare and compare for this. So doing this in code, this is just, here's every backup job that I've got, here's the VM names that are in here, this is the repository that it lives on, and then this is the disk mode that I've got for it. I've reset everything that I have back to all disks, but basically for every one of these VMs, it would show me if it was all disks versus selected disks, and then if there was a specific filter, it would give me back any of the VM disks that were actually selected for backup. And it's a pretty quick and easy way to go through and report against your entire environment, if you just learn the details of what it is you're looking for, and then just kind of how to pile these things together, and it's, with all the formatting and everything that I've got in here, this backup size report is 100 lines of code, but as you can see, the majority of this is like blank lines, right? There's not a whole lot to it. The actual report bit that itself, where I'm getting these details, is this section of 7 or 8 lines of code. There's really not a whole lot to this once you know how to get around the environment and just kind of how to build out the reporting.
Joe, I've got a quick question if we can put this in before we miss
Go
it. What about using PowerShell for VBO 365, specifically for bulk operations? And that's from Blake.
Yeah, so I had another one. Let me go flip over. Let me copy the code that I've got out of that, because I had a customer environment that I was having to do a little bit of work with Tim Smith on, and it was around adding O365 group mailboxes. So hold on a second, let me get my code up and running, just so I can copy and paste this in to my development box over here. And again, this is one of those where, the bundle of the code itself is not even the hugely important part in this, because there's a lot of this that was just extra stuff we had to put in for padding and reporting. But really, this script gives functionality to automatically add all Office 365 group mailboxes that are not currently in a backup job into a name that we give it. And then it's set to process only the group mailbox, not members, right? So this is just for, basically we had a customer that was looking for Office 365 groups that may have been removed from O365, but still exist in the backup job, and they wanted to remove them as well. So there's, 2 different ways to use this thing. And really, this is all the connectivity for, logging and then connecting to VBO. To add the group mailboxes, this is all we really did here, right? Get the job, get the organization, get all the groups under this organization that are not in a job. And then we said for each group in that collection of all the groups, new VBO backup item with the group that's in that loop, and then that it's a group mailbox type, so that we get the group mailbox and not the members. And like, the core functionality of all this code is just that we're getting the original job that we're trying to attach to, we're getting the organization, we're getting all these groups, and then we're just saying for anything that's not in a job, like, go toss it in there. So again, it's one of those where, we've got 100 and some odd lines of code to do all of this stuff, but really in the end, it's this little block of code of these couple of lines that's all that you're really having to do to go add things that are missing in a backup job for Office 365. And we've got the same thing for remove deleted. It's this. Ignore the ugly parsing. There was some stuff we had to do to make this work, just because it's not easily visible within the logs. But basically, in this one, we're even going through and looking for a log from a job session, and we're looking for where we see warning of blank was not found. So this gives us back like a group name was not found in the last run of the job. And anytime it finds that, then it's going through and removing that backup item with this right here. We're just saying for this job, for this backup item of the group that we found that matched that name, just go remove it. So there's a lot of additional stuff that you can do for Office 365. This being just a simple example of adding groups or removing groups that even had a problem. That Tim did the bulk of this code. I really only had to help him some with the bit at the bottom for doing the regular expressions to parse out the job logs, and that whole thing probably took maybe, I don't know, 2 hours to go get it functional and make it look pretty. So yeah, there's tons of stuff that we can do with Office 365 and the built-in commandlets for it, as well as through the API coverage for VAO that you can do with just core PowerShell. It's really just kind of learning the product and then seeing what it looks like under the covers when you're looking at the command line interface. All right, so I guess just to give a quick overview for folks that have not seen it, this is the API for Enterprise Manager, right? And I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of this. For those of you that don't know, there actually is a browser-based version of the API Explorer on Enterprise Manager. You can find this inside of the documentation for the Enterprise Manager REST API docs. And basically, when you go to any Enterprise Manager, for me, this is my box, OS Veeam BEM. You can just go to this port and then tack web at the end of it, and you hit this page that just gives you an API that you can click and browse through. So for here, I'm going to go to the latest version of the API. All I need to do is hit submit on this post method, and then type in my credentials. And here you go, guys. This is the API for Enterprise Manager that's driving backup and recovery. And this doesn't matter if you're running single BNR server, backup and replication. I'm sorry, guys. I will specify I've been using this since V5, and I still keep getting hung up on BNR being, backup and recovery. Whether you're running a single BNR server underneath Enterprise Manager or multiples, this is where you'll see everything. It doesn't matter if you have a single or multiple BNR servers, you're going to get the same view from Enterprise Manager. So when I go into backup servers, I will see, like if I want to look at the entities of all of the servers that I have, these are all of my servers, right? The real key thing to focus in on here is the name. This is the name of my backup and replication server that's attached to Enterprise Manager. If I go back up to the top level here and log back in, I can look at things like my jobs, right? I want to see every job that exists inside of here. And every one of these blobs of XML code that's here is a differing job, So you can look under here and you can see the name of all of these. For where I've got this format entity and the name, this is every one of my jobs that exists inside of this instance of BNR that I've got in my lab environment. And you can look at all the different sessions that exist under these jobs, because these are all the things that are linked. Everything's got basically an up and a down reference inside of an API to be able to just walk the API and connect from one to the other. So let me go back to the API. And then you're going to see this structured similar to the way that I was kind of explaining that things are inside of PowerShell, and also similar to the way that you're going to see stuff inside the API, right? Inside of the BNR UI. You have jobs, and then you've got a difference for your backups, and then you've got a different object for your replicas. You're going to see all of this stuff separated out here as well. Here I've got all of my jobs. Here I've got all of my backups. Here I've got details of my repositories. This is where I'm going to see restore points for jobs themselves. This is where I'm going to see VM restore points. That's actually going to be the detail of any individual VM that I've got inside of here. Same thing for vApps. And then you're going to see like this catalog of VMs will be the catalog of all VMs that it knows about. There's not a ton of built-in reporting inside of the API. If you come in here for reports, you're only going to see like an overview, VMs overview, job statistics, number of processed VMs, and then the repositories that are inside of here. Just so everybody knows, we don't have 100% coverage in the API for everything you can do in the UI. The product was built and established a long ways before the API came around for it. And there's just some of the things that we do in the UI, and especially because we do it in a wizard fashion, where these things are essentially transactional. When you start creating a repository and you're mapping to, say, a data domain or to an exegrid, when you put in credentials and you hit next, it'll actually go through and it'll try and talk to that storage unit that you're trying to add and validate that it connected properly. Or if you're adding a new Windows server to be a proxy, when you go click next, a lot of times you'll see that it goes and it actually starts installing the MSIs for the transport services, and it adds the extra functionality on those roles. That's a lot of stuff that's not normally intended to be in an API, because the API doesn't give you any sort of a rollback, right? It's intended to be one-off actions that you're taking. So our API is great for reporting. There's just a lot of things that you cannot do in the API. There's a lot of changes you can't do. You can't add jobs. You can't go and create repositories from scratch. These are just things that, again, a lot of it has to do with how the product itself is written and a lot of the ways that it's managed. These things are in a transaction where every time you do something inside of the BNR UI in the wizard, if you fail at a single step, basically you can go back to retry it, or you can hit cancel, right? That's the meaning of it being transactional. It has to complete 100% end to end for it to be successful and for you to be able to hit finish. Otherwise, it lets you go back one step to try and correct whatever mistake you ran into, or you have to cancel, and that's it. And basically, if it doesn't complete 100%, you can't continue any further. Inside of an API, you just send it like, I want to change, I want to remove, I want to update, or I want to delete something, and that's it. So with not having that kind of functionality in the product itself, to be able to do like little checkpoints on it that are also exposed to the API, that's a lot of why we have some functionality that just doesn't exist inside of the API. And that's probably one of the number one questions I get from most of the SE org, especially as it relates to our competitors, is what does our API look like, and what are the limitations that we have compared to what they've got. And some of this just comes down to like differentiation of other products being API first, so they have tons of API coverage, but if you look their product set and like what they can actually do, there's not a ton of stuff behind those APIs. They can do backups and they can do restores, and that's it. So if you're doing a lot of really simple things, it's really easy to do API coverage for that. Whereas, again, our product was just kind of written, and there was a lot of stuff built into the product before the API came out. So we have tons of advanced functionality that it's then really hard to try and go back through and cram that to make it easily accessible in an API where, again, this is the whole point of the API is it's super easy. I'm going to go do this exact thing, and it's exposed to where I can just click on stuff. I want to go see every restore point I have on this VM for this one domain controller inside of here, and it shows me, hey, look, here's every restore point that you have for this thing. Here's the timestamp that it was created on for all of this stuff. But then to do things like take this restore point and then automatically restore it back with advanced functionality that we have in the product, it gets a little bit difficult to expose all of that cleanly inside of the API. So that's the number one hurdle that we have with working with the API itself. But if anybody wants to, like I said, go read the documentation around the Veeam API. You can find the shortcut, that's just got this port and /web at the end of it that you guys can even go look at inside of the SE lab. I will warn you that with everybody not having full access to as API administrators inside of the lab, there are going to be some things that you can't look at. Like I ran into this when I was doing some reporting and was trying to validate against the internal lab versus just my own personal lab environment. I wasn't able to list out jobs inside of the API in the SE lab. So there's going to be some things that you're going to run into issues with, but this at least gives you the quick, easy overview, and you can just kind of walk through it enough to see for yourself what exists inside of here and like what kind of things can you look at with just clicking through the API. So at this point, I'll ask if anybody else has any questions. Otherwise, I went over what I assumed was going to be the amount of time it would take me to cover everything, mostly because of my connectivity issues at the beginning. So if nobody has any additional questions, then I will say we'll let you guys have 12 minutes.
Okay, Joe, let's give them about 30 seconds or so to pop something in, and then we'll wrap it up, folks. Joe, great stuff today. Thank you so much for sharing this.
Yeah, I will apologize to everybody. I know some of this stuff is either not super interesting, and if you don't necessarily see a direct need for it, or if you don't have a customer that's asking for it right now, some of this stuff is a little bit hard to ingest all at once. It's the kind of drinking from a fire hose. But again, I'm working on some guides. I've got the 101 stuff that we covered that's already written out in a guide that everybody can go back and follow along in text. So it's a little bit easier to chunk these things out. And
Joe,
then if anybody has questions, like
yeah,
with customers going forward, sure, go ahead.
I apologize. I'm not trying to I just want to make sure
No,
we
no.
work this last one in. This is from Andy Perkins. Can you show or talk on JSON just for a couple seconds?
Yeah, so for anybody that's worked with the API in the past, this view that I have right here that's coming back from our API is XML, right? This was the standard of what we had inside of Enterprise Manager from like version 1.1 of the API that came out through version 1.3, which was released with 9.5 update 3. With 9.5 update 4, let me go back and start from the beginning of this thing, just so everybody can get an example of this. This is where our API started, right? Version 1, and then we went all the way up through 1.3, or sorry, 1_3 here, with 9.5 update 3. With update 4 that came out, we got this new version of the API, and version 1.4 or 1_4 of the API gave us the functionality to actually get back JSON. So this is just a different format, right? XML was really kind of a structured format more for, say, web views and things like this. Um, and the reason that there's really a difference with this is that XML will give you this nice formatting, and if you have an XML interpreter, it'll give you this breakdown where it says, I know this opening links bracket is here and this closing links is here. Therefore, this opening supported versions is here and the closing one is down here. So it gives you this broken out tree view. When you run JSON, it will give you back all of this stuff in basically one gigantic line of text. I don't have a sample of the JSON code, and I don't want to flip over to my other desktop and pull up Postman to be able to display it. But really, it's just a difference between XML being a structured view on this, and JSON would be all of this stuff gets returned back to you. Like if I were to just copy and paste this with no formatting into Notepad. Let's see. Oh no, yeah, I can't even unformat it because it came from Chrome with the plugin that I've got in there. So that's really the primary difference between XML and JSON. And then what that really means to most people that are trying to consume the API, it's just dependent on if their language that they're using or if the utility that they're using to drive the API is better with formatting with XML or if it's JSON. And there's a lot of tools that are out there that really only handle one as their primary, and they just have like basic functionality for the other format.